So, this idea of fandom, and in our case, it's Star Wars fandom, but really we're looking at fandom in general, and you can apply this to like sports fandom as well. Why are things becoming so caustic? Why are people becoming so hateful? And there's so many examples we could lay out. We could literally spend a whole podcast just giving examples of how we're seeing such negative, immature, bizarre behavior over a Star Wars, sci-fi fantasy film franchise. And so, we see everything from people are having death threats because they think a certain way about Star Wars. We've seen such hate over people's positions on what they think,
Right.
And so what do you think is causing this? Because relatively, if you look at the history of fanfare in the United States of America, this is a relatively, recent sort of occurrence. I mean, there's been the occasional, sports fan shows up at the opposing team's, home field for a game and, mouths off and, someone punches them,
Right.
But it's becoming such commonplace. And we're not only seeing it in kind of the sports context, we're seeing it in like geekdom, where people are just downright offensive and awful.
Yeah.
Why? What do you think causes this type of behavior?
Well, part of it, I think, is that it's easy now. It's easy to be this angry troll and just spew your venom everywhere because all you have to do is click a couple of keyboard letters and there you go. It's out there for the rest of the world to read.
And you're not seeing them. There's no physical face-to-face kind of contact.
I'm not going to, the opposing team's sports arena and sitting there surrounded by orange and black as I'm in my green and yellow A's jersey and, dealing with Giants fans and everything.
Watch yourself.
You can say whatever you want when you're sitting in your cozy chair in front of your screen
with
and
your
nobody's
cup of hot
around.
chocolate and, you're C-3PO because you think he's the greatest ever. And you can, sorry, Devin.
Wow.
And you can just spew that hate so easily now. With very little repercussions.
I think that's part of it. Just the fact that there are no one to say, hey, stop talking like that.
Yeah.
Or seeing the reaction of the person. Like Louis C.K. famously had this kind of bit in his comedy routine where he talks about, how technology has kind of affected us, how we're always looking at our screens and not at people. And, he said something to the effect of like, if you call someone a horrible name and then you see them like wince and start to like cry, you might go, oh man, that didn't feel good me saying that to them. But because we're behind these screens, it emboldens people. I'm not saying everybody, but it does embolden some people to say things that are completely and totally inappropriate. Other thoughts though, like why do you think this is occurring? And maybe specifically, why are we seeing this in sort of the Star Wars world, the Star Wars fan world?
I think one of the things is that original trilogy was so apart for so long that it developed this fandom and people had this almost sense of ownership. They had loved Star Wars for so long that you almost couldn't touch it without offending those original Star Wars fans in some way because it didn't happen the way they wanted or it wasn't what they expected. And how could you do this to my beloved Star Wars? It's that sense of ownership. And, in all honesty, the prequels had a lot to live up to when it came to those fans that had that ownership for that.
Yeah.
There's that documentary, The People versus George Lucas. I don't know if you guys have seen it, but
yes.
There's that famous moment,
Brutal.
where the fans are like talking about the Phantom Menace when it released and how it just took all their wind out of their sails. But there was like genuine like anger and hatred to Lucas and toward the people that made it, and maybe even toward, unfortunately, Jake Lloyd, where, I mean, can you imagine you're just constantly seeing online just how horrible you are, and I just keep going back, like, why does this happen? And I don't want it to happen to me. You know what I mean? Like that's sort of because I when The Force Awakens came out, there was an article in GQ and just talking about fandom in general. And here's a quote from that article in the GQ magazine. The writer says, it happens a lot in what's called geek culture. People being jerks, because geek culture implies more than just passive enjoyment. And here's the quote that sort of floored me. The writer says, it demands participation. It asks you to hitch your identity to these things. And so and when I look back at the Phantom Menace, and you know, in my context, I'm 40 years old, I'm 41. I saw the original trilogy in the theaters, you know, so I was sort of that generation that when I was in my 20s when the prequels came out, and when the Phantom Menace came out, I was a little bit disappointed, you know, after I saw it 11 times.
Thank you for the clarification.
You know, I have to.
Yeah.
You know, there's a difference between a little disappointed,
yes,
and then lashing out.
Yeah, and I think, you know, for me, I love Star Wars, but I don't know if my identity has been wrapped up into it. Mm-hmm. And as I think about, well, how can I avoid it? How can I avoid it? I kind of land there. I don't know. What do you guys think about that idea? Like, is it when it becomes our identities? Is that when it becomes dangerous, or am I just not thinking clearly about this?
I think a couple of things. One of the things I think is, you know, thank goodness for social media that we have access to all of these fan theories and articles and all this, right? Because that's truly what brings a lot of us together, and we can keep in the fold and the things that we enjoy, whether it's Star Wars or something else. And at the same time, we are cursed by social media.
Yeah.
There's an expectation, I think, because of social media, that not only does everybody have an opportunity to have a voice, but your voice is important and should be heard. And I think that's a dangerous thing. It's a very dangerous thing. And how it's modeled in media, in culture, is not always the most positive. I mean, we have everyone from celebrities to politicians maybe not being the most positive influence out there.
Yeah, yeah.
And so if so-and-so can do it, well, then that's what's modeled for me. So therefore, then that's what I'm going to use it for, or how I'm going to use it.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think to address your most recent point about identity, I think that's obviously something that we need to individually take a look at. Like whatever we're seeing ourselves as, whatever we attach our identity to, that can determine a lot about how we respond to things, whether that's a film or a sports team or a great number of other things that are in the news now.
Yeah, I guess the things we love are part of our identity. Like they sort of make, you know, like, so if I love a certain band, I might, you know, think about the world in a similar way that they think about the world, you know, because of the influence they're having on me. And it sort of makes sense that if my identity is somehow intertwined with the Star Wars franchise and one of the movies sucks, I'm not going to be real happy.
Sure.
But I think there's some sort of filter that's missing, and I don't know what that is. I truly have no idea. That when you get to that, I'm bummed out, I'm not really happy with this, that you get to a point where that filter's gone, that you'll just kind of lash out or call something horrible things or make some statements to people that are absolutely horrible or have agendas kind of based around that.
Well, and I think that's another thing that comes out of it, right? Can be often, especially in, as this author puts, kind of like the geek culture.
Yeah.
Right? There becomes an arrogance with it.
Yeah.
How could you believe that? How could you think that?
How can you like that film?
Right. And or that theory or whatever else, right?
Yeah.
And there becomes a bit of arrogance with that. And it's not unlike, and I think for a lot of people, whether it's Star Wars or their sports team or perhaps their music band, whatever it is, that becomes their idol and their religion of sorts. And when that happens, then people tend to defend it by any means or all means necessary.
Yeah.
And I think that the arrogance and the territorial wars and all those things that, like, we don't need to fight those. Like, the fact that you went to see Phantom Menace 11 times in the theater, and even if you were to think it's like the best of the saga, even if you were to think that, I would totally disagree with you.
Yeah.
And yet, like, we can still sit down and do a podcast together.
Yeah, absolutely.
Or our families can get together or whatever else.
Yeah.
And
so that line is now being crossed.
Right.
You know,
right, exactly.
And one of the things that I keep coming back to is like, why is this happening? Like, why is this going on? And you see so many people getting really hurt. I mean, just this past week, someone that I respect a great deal in sort of the Star Wars podcasting community said, I give up.
Right.
Wow.
And it's because people are being so horrible to him.
Right.
And I just, I'm like, my goodness, like, what are we coming to? And because when we went to Celebration a year ago, I found everyone to be incredibly pleasant. I found the atmosphere to be delightful.
Right.
But, hearing a little bit more what was going on sort of behind the scenes with some of these fans, I'm kind of cringing and like, like, really? Like, people are this hostile toward others that don't see it the way they do.
Well, and I think that that's a critical part, right? Because regardless of the article that we read regarding that particular situation and that other podcast, and we understand that was, one side of the story, though you could read the comments that certainly painted a different picture.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? But here's the point, I think, is let's disagree, but let's respect each other at the same time.
Exactly.
And I mean, that goes back to Martin Luther King Jr. just talking about, right? Feel free to disagree with a person's position, but you respect the person.
Yeah, respect the man.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so I think that that's a critical part of it, that let's absolutely enter into dialogue. Let's disagree, but let's also draw boundaries and let's not make this personal.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, speaking of just kind of the mind and fandom and all that kind of stuff, you're going to probably start a series in the coming weeks, months?
Yeah, I would say we'll probably drop that in the next couple of weeks.
Yeah.
We're starting a series on this very thing, fandom.
Oh, cool.
And
cool.
We're starting off with talking to a licensed therapist about the identity and the mindset of being a fan. And
wow.
If there is a line, where is that line drawn? Can you be addicted to Star Wars? And I think our listeners may be surprised to hear what she has to say about that.
Wow.